One.
Hello, you good people, and happy Wednesday. Happy Peikoff Wednesday. At least we're calling it Wednesday. You can call it what you want according to your philosophy. It's 11 o'clock Eastern time. Hey, you laugh. You laugh, James Valliant, but it's 11 o'clock Eastern time. It's 8 o'clock on the West Coast, 4 o'clock in the UK. Obviously, we need an open system for interpreting time. Anything goes. Anything goes.
Anything goes.
James Valliant, how are you doing on this today? How are you doing on this fine Wednesday?
I'm doing great. As you can see, the morning sun is streaming in here in Southern California, and it's a beautiful day. And I'm doing fantastic.
Outstanding. I'm being a little lighthearted because we're dealing with heavy matters and matters that are going to hit home for people, and I want them to hit home for people, but we've got to introduce at least a little levity around the edges because this is heavy and important stuff. We had some controversy last Thursday. There was a great conversation between the great Mark Pellegrino and Jack Schumann and Paul Gay, and really smart people went maybe a little off the rails, and we had to dial that back. And you had a great conversation yesterday on the Daily Objective. If anybody missed that, right after this show, give that a listen, talking about open philosophy, closed philosophy, open objectivism, closed objectivism. And I hope that people heard everything that you had to say, because the last thing we want are simplistic answers to this important topic. I'm not going to go bashing people, at least not until we're done, until we lay this groundwork. This is important stuff. And I'm going to give everybody a taste of what I mean by that right at the start. No more chat. I want to read the first question. The first question in the questions we're going to consider today that Leonard Peikoff was asked and that were reprinted, republished, compiled in the book, Keeping It Real, Bringing Ideas Down to Earth. Leonard Peikoff was asked this: what does it mean for a philosophy to be a closed system? Is Ayn Rand's philosophy a closed system? Okay, that's pretty straightforward, pretty easy. What does Leonard Peikoff say? And I hesitate at the end of the question because when I read a question like that, what does it mean for a philosophy to be a closed system? Is Ayn Rand's philosophy a closed system? I already know some of the controversy. I already know my own baggage, and the answers start coming to me. And if I jump right to Leonard Peikoff's answer, it's almost too easy. I miss some points. Here's what Leonard Peikoff had to say. See if this surprises y'all a little bit. I want to hear from you in the chat. Leonard Peikoff says, well, a closed system is a philosophy that is an interconnected system of principles, which are immutable and which cannot tolerate any contradiction. Otherwise, the whole system would collapse. That is a closed system. It's just a collection of different ideas that can, if it is just a collection of different ideas. If it's just a collection of different ideas that can stand or fall on their own, well, then it's open, meaning it's not a system. What is open about a philosophy is the application of that philosophy to concrete cases, because many are not deductible from the philosophy, even though they presuppose it. Well, we've seen that in these podcasts over and over, breaking from the quote. Remember, these answers were originally given, and this is kind of amazing. I know that he used notes, but so much of this was extemporaneous. Leonard Peikoff answering these difficult and complex questions, not for publishing a book, but in a podcast. And yet they stand up so well in this book. Going back to Leonard Peikoff, there are many options on how to treat love and hobbies and careers, how you assess the current scene and your predictions of the future and so forth. Philosophies are, quote unquote, open only in the sense that they admit within limits a variety of applications and even disagreements. What people mean when they say that it's bad for a philosophy to be a closed system, again, Leonard Peikoff here, and they even use the word system, which means all interconnected, is that they want everything to be optional about the philosophy. Not just, for instance, the choice of whether you should go into law or medicine, but whether you should even have a career, whether you should do anything long range. It's all subjective. It's whatever you want. In other words, Its philosophy is a bunch of fortune cookies thrown together and open to any new one. It's the end of philosophy, this so-called open philosophy. If you've ever talked to anyone who prides himself on having what he calls an open mind means an empty mind. It means no matter what you tell him, he'll say, yeah, that's interesting, but so-and-so is interesting, and such is interesting. Such a person praises himself on never closing a question. The absurd thing is, there are people who believe that Ayn Rand is right, but object to the fact that she is interpreted by me and others as a closed system.
Wow.
Close quote, Leonard Peikoff.
Well, this is true. You know, the truth is that knowledge is a really vast topic, isn't it? Philosophy is one topic within it. Now, it's a very special topic within the area of philosophy. It's part of objectivism. Philosophy lies at the base of the hierarchy of human knowledge. And because of that, it operates in generalized principles. And a philosophical principle is a generalization reached on a philosophical question. It's not yet a system. But when we tie together our philosophical principles into an integrated, interconnected system, and Ayn Rand's philosophy is particularly integrated in this sense. Nowadays, of course, if you go to a philosophy university class, they'll disintegrate you. That's their task, is to disintegrate your mind. And many of the professors will be in this state that Leonard was talking about, very proud that they've never closed off any question. Oh, well, that's subject to debate. And now, well, that's interesting. Everything is interesting and everything is an open question. But of course, that's not Ayn Rand. Ayn Rand believed that she did arrive at valid principles. In order to validate these principles, she grounded them in reality, but she also interconnected them with everything else in philosophy, so that every single one of her fundamental principles in philosophy interconnects with every single one of her other principles in philosophy. If you know the difference between a philosophical principle and an application or a non-philosophical position, take Ayn Rand had a favorite color, turquoise blue. It was her favorite color. You go into her apartment, you'll see all the throw pillows will be turquoise blue. Is there any philosophical significance to that? No. And so what people do is they confuse Ayn Rand's personal views with her philosophical principles. If we're talking about just her philosophical principles, not her favorite color and throw pillows, but we're talking about truly a philosophical principle. How spicy Ayn Rand wanted her pad thai noodles when she went to a Southeast Asian restaurant does not follow from the principles of objectivism, okay? It simply does not. And there are many questions in life like that, either applications of philosophical principles or things that are simply not philosophical at all. It's the field of physics or the field of chemistry or the field of geology or something. No, what we're talking about is philosophical principles. Ayn Rand's philosophical principles are so tightly integrated and they buttress one another. And this is a critical part of her very understanding of epistemology. All knowledge has to be integrated into a unified, logically consistent whole. And when Ayn Rand developed her philosophy, she was very, very self-conscious of that. Every principle, in effect, supports every other one and is integrated into a unified whole. To take any basic principle of objectivism out of its context means you've rejected the entire philosophy. The entire philosophy. If you reject, she said, as I said yesterday, famously, she said, I'm not primarily an advocate of capitalism, but of egoism. And I'm not primarily an advocate of egoism, but of reason. If you accept reason, the rest follows. What she's saying is that it's not just a grab, like what Leonard says, a fortune cookie, a grab bag of fortune cookies. No. If you reject a philosophical principle of objectivism, you've rejected the whole of objectivism. I want to say that again. If you reject any of the principles of objectivism, you've rejected the whole of it, the philosophy of it. You're something else. You're not an objectivist. You may have some overlap with objectivism. You may say, okay, I agree with her on this, that, and the other, but you're not an objectivist. To add the word open to the idea that, oh, well, no, of course, we can still tamper with principles that Ayn Rand asserted as philosophical principles is to reject objectivism. Open objectivism is an anti-concept. It's like extremism, the way Ayn Rand defined extremism. It is a logically useless concept designed to supplant a valid concept. Ghost, unicorn, you could name a whole bunch of them, but a lot of perhaps the most egregious of all the anti-concepts out there, in my view, is this open objectivism idea. It is a total anti-concept. It destroys the very concept, the open part destroys the very concept it's attempting to modify, in my view. So one can differ with Ayn Rand about whether Beethoven was malevolent. We had that discussion the other day. One could disagree with Ayn Rand about the nature of femininity, or all kinds of psychological issues, all kinds of applications in the philosophy of law that Ayn Rand never addressed, that still have yet to be addressed, in my view. There are all kinds of issues that Ayn Rand didn't address that aren't part of her basic philosophical principles. On that score, it's a tightly integrated, interconnected system, grounded in reality and dependent, and the principles are all interdependent upon one another. To talk about something like open objectivism is to profoundly misunderstand Ayn Rand's entire approach to objectivism, is to disagree with one of the premises of objectivism walking in the door. As John Galt said, no concept, and I would say this about any theory, any proposition, any universal, no concept is valid unless it can be integrated consistently and without contradiction into the rest of our knowledge. And Ayn Rand was particularly keen about having a tightly integrated, interconnected system of ideas. You can't just pull out, if it's a philosophical principle, not just some view she had on some other topic, like her favorite color or how spicy she wants her noodles. But if it's a philosophical principle, if you reject it, you've rejected the whole of objectivism. So open objectivist people are wanting their cake and eating it too. They want to glom on, in effect, to Ayn Rand's fan base. They want to get the fuzzy, warm glow that some people have, and some people don't study philosophy a lot. They just have this superficial emotional glow. Yeah, I kind of agree with Ayn Rand. They want to suck those less thoughtful people in with this idea, well, then it's open to whatever you want to do with it. Well, it is not if it's a philosophical principle. Ayn Rand has worked it out, you know what I mean?
Just laying down that much leads to some interesting questions. And in my own mind, this question of open, closed functions on two different levels. The easy answer, and to me, the clear and indisputable answer is that every philosophy is closed, or rather, every philosophy that is an integrated system of thought. Aristotelianism is closed. I can call myself an Aristotelian, but I couldn't come up with something that Aristotle never thought of, or something that contradicts something Aristotle said and say, this is part of Aristotelianism. Because it's so consistent, I figured it out and it belongs there. Well, no, it's not. It's something Robert Nasir thought. I might be right. It's still not part of Aristotelianism. It's bizarre to take any philosophy and say, well, okay, objectivism is what Ayn Rand called her philosophy, but now I'm going to put other things in it because I think they're consistent with it.
Well, there are some philosophers that are anti-integration, that are overtly opposed to the idea of integration, whether it's possible or whether it's even desirable. And let me suggest that some of these advocates of, quote, open objectivism are probably in this category. If they really do believe philosophy is just a random grab bag of fortune cookies, just little aphorisms here and there, little bits of wisdom, disintegrated from one another, then maybe it wouldn't be such a sin to approach them that way. They don't approach ideas that way. They don't regard basic ideas as interconnected. They have no desire to integrate their knowledge into a consistent whole. And so they're kind of telling us up front, you don't need to bother with that with me. But on the other hand, you're absolutely right. Walking in the door, I wouldn't do this to Immanuel Kant. I wouldn't do this to Rene Descartes. I wouldn't do this to Plato, much less to Aristotle, someone who I have profound disagreements with. If I were to say, for example, that Aristotle's argument for natural slavery, I disagree with it, but I'm still an Aristotelian. To some extent, I would have to define what I mean by that. Obviously, in this regard, I'm not. Ayn Rand went out of her way, for example, in the area where she thought Aristotle was such a contributor in the field of epistemology, to distinguish. Now, he believed form was metaphysical. I believe essence is epistemological. She went out of her way to distinguish herself because she did associate herself with Aristotle. And so the area where she most agreed with him, she wanted to make very clear where she agreed and where she disagreed. And at the end of the day, after 2,300 some years, I can see the connection between Aristotle and Ayn Rand, but they are two very different thinkers. You cannot equate the two. Yes, he had a profound impact on Ayn Rand's thinking, but Aristotelianism is not objectivism. Objectivism is a whole lot more and different. And yeah, I wouldn't do that to any thinker. But like I say, some of these thinkers, even the ones who invite us to do it, these disintegrated types who say that you can't integrate knowledge. And these open objectivist people are obviously people who reject the whole basis of Ayn Rand's epistemology, this demand for total integration. They've rejected that basic an idea in Ayn Rand's epistemology. So anyone who advocates an open objectivist is an enemy of objectivism. Let's just say that right up front, because some of the most fundamental ideas in objectivism, just this one basic epistemological position, would be a wrecking ball, in effect, to the entire approach that Ayn Rand takes to her thinking on every other topic: politics, art, ethics, you name it. If you don't have this epistemological premise in line with Ayn Rand's, you've taken a wrecking ball to the entire thing. I think people can see it when it comes to something like integration. And it's integration that these open objectivist people are so profoundly disagreeing with objectivism about, and still keeping the word objectivism in a perverse way, in my view.
Yes. The reason I mentioned two different ways of using the term open is because I see people conflate it. The question of a philosophy is what the philosophy is. And then that unique thing in this philosophy, in objectivism, the unique aspect of objectivism is that it is tightly integrated. You could read even Immanuel Kant, and you could take his theory of justice and then compare that to his epistemology, and you can find breaks in it, and you could accept one without the other. And even then, you would have to say, well, Kant's philosophy was what Kant's philosophy was. And even if I figure out he was wrong here, the whole thing was his philosophy. And that's why I say when we label a philosophy, when we figure out what a philosophy is, it really is the philosophy of the philosopher. The philosophy was put forward by the philosopher. Now, the second level, the second question is, and unique to Ayn Rand, the philosophy is consistent. It's a whole. There are other philosophies where you can throw out parts. You can't do that with objectivism. As soon as I say, well, yeah, but I also believe in faith. I believe in religion. I believe that some things are subjective. As soon as I throw out any part of it and then go back to the rest of it, it all falls apart. Even if I was, young and honest and really trying to, it would all fall apart. So the reason I mention those two aspects is because we've got some great comments and a few great questions, super chat as well. So if I can take just a moment before I jump to the second question here, and we're going to go a lot further with this. I've got to say thank you to Francis El Caron for joining, for becoming a YouTube member. Welcome to you and your new membership. We had a comment earlier in the chat before the super chats came in. The Cyrano d'Ancona is such a great screen name. If you're not averse to stealing fictional characters' names, and in this context, I'm okay with that. But he says, when I first read The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, The Passion of Ayn Rand's Critics, that would be this book here. Such a great volume.
Not that I advertise it much.
Just a little bit. But he says it was amazing. The psychotherapy going on was shocking. We may get into that. You certainly had that opportunity yesterday. Folks, you've got to hear yesterday's TDO. The concepts of psychoepistemology, sense of life, and a stylized life became much more clear to me. I totally get that. And you see that also in the collection, the journals of Ayn Rand. So many of her collected writings that were not specifically her philosophical writings. Just such a great mind, but especially a great spirit.
Thank you so much for that comment. I integrated so much at that level myself in writing the book. So I am grateful that you had that similar experience. Thank you.
Yes. DWN Logic. Hello, Dan. big super chat, comes in with a generous $49.99 and said, let's see what he says that goes with that enormous contribution. To support the Ayn Rand Center UK, remember your super chats. Support the Ayn Rand Center UK. And Dan said, I finally got to catch you guys live. Thanks to the both of you so much. I've watched every episode, and I am currently reading James' first book regarding the brand. Well, there you go. So right there, I guess this is going to be a theme here, because we are talking about open objectivism, which is a contradiction in terms. Of course, we're talking about the critics of Ayn Rand, whether they're willing to acknowledge it or not. So yes, The Passion of Ayn Rand's critics, a must read, and thank you very much for that. Michael Sweet is in with a super chat, says an important foundational topic. I absolutely agree with that. But that question about foundational, well, we'll have a question on that. Kindred Amy is in for a generous $20 and says, my take, a closed system does not mean intrinsicism or dogma, but an integrated with reality system. An open system is a disintegrated mess. The only integrated philosophy is objectivism, as in it's objective. And finally, Wyatt is in with a $2 super chat and says, for $2 here, you're going to have to give us $1,000 answer here, James Valliant. How do you differentiate which are fundamental?
If it is a philosophical principle as such is fundamental. Right. So if I were to say the Ayn Rand's principle of honesty, it's a philosophical fundamental. Now, I can't justify that. I can't give you a clue as to how Ayn Rand understood that if I don't do a whole lot more work. I have to start with metaphysics. I have to work out a methodology for this. I have to apply that methodology. You have to see the role of values in human life, what values are, where they come from, why we have them, why we pursue them, why reason is basic to human survival and how that is the primary virtue. And I'd have to make this entire argument, but all those steps that are part of that, you see, to get me to honesty. But honesty itself is a fundamental. So I would give you a general rule of thumb like this. If you could find it in Leonard Peikoff's OPAR, it is a basic principle to objectivism. Leonard Peikoff went out of his way to include every principle Ayn Rand thought of as an important philosophical principle and to connect it, tie it up in just this way. The great achievement of Leonard Peikoff's Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, is that it gives you the answer to precisely that. All of Ayn Rand's basic principles are there laid out and their interconnection with one another. So the very thing that we're talking about here can be found in Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand. If it's not in there, you have an argument, it seems to me, prima facie, because Leonard didn't include it, but it's obviously not his authority that does this. You'd have to look, obviously, into all of Ayn Rand's writings to see this, what areas she didn't have, say, an answer to. As I said, there are areas, it's a specialized topic, philosophy of law, say. There are many questions in that area that she did not have an answer to. And so they weren't a part of her integrated system. But as a general rule, I would tell you OPAR is a great place to find those because he lays them all out and he shows how they integrate with one another.
Excellent. Yeah, we can probably do a whole show on
found integrated with reality. Integrated with reality. See, that's the whole thing. Reality is all interconnected. This is why our knowledge must be totally integrated. It's not as though there are pieces of reality floating out there, totally different, obeying their own laws of metaphysics and physics, and different over here. A different set of mathematics applies to this universe. We're not living in some multi-dimensional, chaos. No. Reality is all interconnected. And this requires us to have our knowledge be all interconnected, just as interconnected as reality is. And so to reject objectivism as, in effect, a closed system in this sense is to reject its connection to reality. What you're saying is that these interconnections are actually optional to whether or not it's valid, whether it corresponds to reality. Ayn Rand did not believe that. You have to reduce it to observed reality, but the reality test is not over. Everything has still got to be integrated and consistent with one another. So with Ayn Rand, it's a reality test. this integration. If you reject that, then you're rejecting the reality basis that Ayn Rand gives it. If you know Ayn Rand's approach to inductive validity, it's this horizontal integration. It's this how everything else integrates with everything else that gives us this inductive certainty as we move up. So to reject this approach to integration is to reject certainty, is to reject the reality test. Amy, you nailed it. That's what they're saying. They're saying that some important part of Ayn Rand's thought is false, disconnected to reality, and I want to be able to play with it. And they need to justify that. So if I were to say Kant, okay, Kant, I agree with you about this and this and this, but I disagree with you here. The honest thing is not to say, well, let's have open Kantianism. The honest thing to say is, I disagree with Kant here, even if you agree with Kant about this, this, and this. The honest thing is to say, this is not Kantianism with respect to that. And that's where these open objectivism people are not just wrong, but in my view, dishonest in many cases.
Excellent. Yes. Now we have another super chat that came in, and this one's sure to be controversial, except I don't know the source material for it, and I don't know if you do either. Daniel is in for $10, and we thank you for that. But he says, thoughts on David Kelly's series of logic textbooks. I've begun to study the 5th edition of The Art of Reasoning, and I find the practice exercises helpful. I do have others I plan to study after. I don't know those books. I don't know that series. I would say, like Nathaniel Brandon's early writings, I wouldn't doubt that there may be helpful things in there. But given the source, I don't have any interest. I can find better places to study them.
Better places. See, that's, well, look, I believe that David Kelly's Evidence of the Senses, published by the Louisiana State University Press, based on his Princeton PhD dissertation under Richard Rorty, is a valuable contribution to philosophy. I believe that his work on abstraction, which his peer-reviewed articles on the theory of abstraction, the psychology of abstraction, have value. That does not mean that his understanding of objectivism is correct and valid. It means he understood one point that might be helpful to us. So I don't have problem citing, I don't have a problem citing a critic of Ayn Rand's even when I'm doing my own research. If I find a scholar to be helpful about a particular point, look, if I find Hegel or Marx to be helpful about a certain point, that I won't hesitate I hope that I make it clear that I very much oppose the ideas of Hegel and Marx, just as I hope that I'm right now making it very clear that I don't think David Kelly understands objectivism. So I would not cite him as an authority on objectivism. The most I would cite him on is, hey, that's a useful logic textbook over there. Or you made a good insight over here about the evidence of the senses, which, of course, he got from Leonard Peikoff and Ayn Rand, by the way. So as Robert says, if we have a clear source in Peikoff and Ayn Rand, which we generally do, I would cite that in preference. But if he makes a good point, if any scholar makes a good point, that one point is not going to make him an expert on objectivism. David Kelly rejects objectivism. I'm going to say this again and put it in italics. Even if we find something useful, because he is influenced by Leonard Peikoff, profoundly influenced by Leonard Peikoff. On the other hand, so there may be useful stuff that he publishes. On the other hand, he rejects objectivism. He is not an advocate of objectivism. I won't bore you by repeating it again, but that's the sharp distinction that I would make.
Let me just put a bow on the previous question then. Even if David Kelly was not an enemy of objectivism, if you took him just up to that first book and those first papers, that stuff's not part of objectivism.
No.
Leonard Peikoff has said flat out, the dim hypothesis is not part of objectivism. Now, I would say it's consistent with objectivism. I would say if Ayn Rand was still around, maybe she would have made it part of objectivism.
Right.
It doesn't change the fact that it's brilliant, but it's not objectivism.
But it's not. There's so many, we're not done. Not even, Ayn Rand had a lot of answers in the field of philosophy. To my way, I studied the history of philosophy. She answered all the big questions in the history of Western philosophy. On the other hand, we have a whole lot more to discover, even in philosophy? Do we have all kinds of truths to discover in philosophy? Yes. And there'll be great philosophers. Let me suggest they'll probably be influenced by objectivism. But Robert, you're so correct. It will not be objectivism, however true, however helpful, however philosophical. And let me also suggest that for it to be valid, it too will have to be part of a tightly integrated, consistent system of thought. So it may be consistent. In fact, from my perspective right now, it would have to be consistent with the rest of objectivism for it to be true. You see, it's one of my reality tests, but it won't be objectivism. Objectivism was defined by Ayn Rand once and for all, full stop. Even true things discovered in philosophy in the future, like the dim hypothesis. I happen to agree. I am a historian, and I studied myself with Dr. Leonard Peikoff. I agree with the dim hypothesis, but Ayn Rand didn't say most of the stuff that he says in that book. It ain't objectivism, folks. It is consistent with objectivism. It is the application of objectivism to historiography, but it's not objectivism.
Good. Maybe I shouldn't go on. I want to get to the second question, but just real quick, I'm an objectivist. But the things I say and believe, I'm not an authority. I'm not Ayn Rand. You're an objectivist. People listening are objectivists. You may hold beliefs that are kind of hard to square with objectivism. The point is, it's a very different thing to say, I'm an objectivist. I also hold a bunch of other beliefs. Because I'm an objectivist, that makes them part of objectivism?
No.
Nonsense.
I wrote another book.
Nobody has any problem with that.
I didn't just write a book that used Ayn Rand's own writings about Ayn Rand. I wrote another book here, Creating Christ. Guess what? It ain't objectivism. It's history. If my theory about the origins of Christianity turns out to be just dead wrong, will it have any implications on objectivism? None whatever. Now, I myself think I was applying objectivist epistemology. I myself used objectivist values as I'm developing the book. That does not make it objectivism. That does not make it objectivism.
And why would you have a chip on your shoulder? Why would you have a chip on your shoulder that the objectivist community won't accept your book, your thesis as part of this philosophy? How dare they? Anyway, let me jump to question two, because we'll come back to that. But I hope that makes it clear to people. And we have another super chat, but I'm going to get to that in a minute. Question number two, what is your opinion, Leonard Peikoff was asked, of objectivist clubs and advocacy groups on the internet? Your opinion, I know, would vary depending on the policies of any particular group, but all things being equal, do you consider this an effective and rational way to spread the right ideas? Well, Leonard Peikoff says, well, first of all, I don't follow any of these groups, so I only have the vaguest knowledge of the little bit that's reported to me. I think as advertising for objectivism, or Atlas Shrugged and Ayn Rand's works, well, it's okay. It doesn't do any harm. You might get some information or some leads from it. But on the whole, I think the potential harms that you got intellectually from such groups is greater than the values you put out, unless you're very selective and careful about what topics you decide to take part in and how you take part. I see, thinking about it, three problems. I'll try to do this real quick. Leonard Peikoff says, if you, as some objectivists I know do, take any question that sounds interesting, and to philosophers, any question sounds remotely interesting, and plunge into it and say, well, this is my contribution, you are going to automatize in your mind the idea that you don't have any special interest to pursue a line of thought. It strikes you offhand as being interesting. It's going to detach your thinking from serious issues, as against a problem which you're really wrestling with, because you think it's important. So I don't think indiscriminate participation like that is at all helpful. Let me stop the quote there for a second, because this is one of my own Robert Nasir. This is one of my personal failure modes. And it's not that I am egalitarian in terms of every question deserves equal attention, but I do tend to take people at face value. And if they ask a question, I want to answer it. And Dr. Peikoff is absolutely right. You can't just take everything that's thrown at you and give it this epistemological and even moral egalitarianism.
Oh, man, am I like you in that way? If anything, I tend to be the kind of guy who'll rush in and give an answer. Look, you seemed like you asked an honest question. It seemed sincere to me. So I'm going to give an answer, the best answer I can. We have to marshal and husband our intellectual resources. More than that, if we do treat everything ideas in this egalitarian way without respect to hierarchy, we're giving the wrong impression as well. There has to be, values cannot be separated from our pursuit of truth. People think, oh, it's a bias, it's subjective. If we include our own values and purposes in this. No, to make the pursuit of truth objective, we need a purpose. It needs to have a value orientation to be objective. Objective. And so, no, we have to be clear about what our priorities are, what's really important, what's relatively important in a field of, questions. And that is crucial. And boy, it's like you, I have to constantly be asking myself, is this worth it? Does this give the wrong impression? And just participating in any discussion on the internet is going to waste your time anyway.
And also, and this is one of my failure modes, is it even an honest question to ask? And in that regard, kindred Amy puts in another super chat and says, what in tarnation is toleration? Talk about an instance of motivated reasoning if I ever saw one.
Right.
Can't we all just get along?
John Locke wrote, a very famous essay concerning toleration. And what he meant was the state tolerating people who disagreed and who had different viewpoints and things like that. If we're talking about the use of force, if we're talking about government use of force, when they put people in jail or censor speech, okay, that's one. Let's not confuse that idea with the idea of tolerance over here. That's not, no guns are here. This is us using our minds, without any force being applied to us. Wait a minute here. If I reject your ideas, that kind of intolerance is not force. I'm not hurting you in any way. My loyalty to my own consciousness and reality has to supersede any agreement with you, or I'm not being objective. I'm not being objective. So when people say we have to tolerate what there's disagreement, what are they saying? We have to, what is this term? Agree to disagree. I'm not quite sure what that means. There's a wonderful meme just on a purely philosopher site that I saw. It said, I guess we'll just have to agree to disagree. And the philosopher comes back, oh, we're philosophers. We don't do that here. We don't do that here. You have to give reasons for why you believe what you believe. If you don't have reasons for why you believe, then you're not even engaged in the thought that we're engaged in here. I hope that helps clarify.
It does. And Leonard Peikoff gives a couple more instances of what can go wrong in this context of advocacy and clubs on the internet. He says, toward his wrap up here, he says, so if you're alone and you're desperate to talk and you try to watch out for these problems, I would say go ahead. But it's certainly not a substitute for thinking with one other person, say, or two, where you have the same orientation and the context. I wouldn't want you to have somebody, a teacher or authority, cowing you into submission. But I do agree that in a lot of these cases, it's the halt leading the blind. One of them will say something is the objectivist view, which is fantastic. And then the other, thinking he's defending an objectivist view, is even more fantastic. I have to explain, when Leonard Peikoff says fantastic, he means fantasy. He means
fantasy, way off base.
Outrageous.
Another realm.
So somebody says, the objectivist view is you should be selfish and crush others. Right. And somebody will accept that and then bounce off of that. And okay, so back to Leonard Peikoff. And then the other person thinking he's defending this objectivist view, see the air quotes here, which is even more fantastic. And the whole thing is just in another dimension.
Yep.
Maybe through the Ayn Rand Institute, you could have programs where people could get some guidance. They don't have to follow the guidance blindly, but at least you get some direction. And then he says, I know when I was learning from Ayn Rand, I could talk to other people, what we used to call the collective, for 2 hours or 5 hours and never really get anywhere. Then I would go to her and she would zing out like a telegram. Well, this is it. And I'd say, oh, I never thought of that. So if you can get somebody who knows more, well, go ahead. If there's a way of identifying who is an expert, because there are a lot of self-proclaimed experts, unquote, Leonard Peikoff. We have a question here in the super chat. And
I just want to say, God, am I lucky to have known and studied from Dr. Leonard Peikoff.
Yeah, you got a bit of what he got from Ayn Rand.
Good God, I was so confused. I was a muddled mess when I first met him, almost 40 years ago. And my thinking needed a lot of clarification, and that's putting it generously. And so when I came to him with all of my misunderstandings of objectivism, or my, amateur shots at an understanding of objectivism, he would patiently and correct me. And it wasn't his authority ever did he use his authority. He would either point me to reality, or he would just sit me down. Okay, Jim, how did this get raised in your head? I want to know how you came to this, and we'll discuss that. It's you, him, and reality when you have that discussion. And so it's not the authority of Leonard Peikoff, it's the authority of the content of what he was delivering to me. Now, but this is true, most internet discussions of objectivism have very little connection to do, anything to do with objectivism. Sometimes they'll go off, and most people in their discussions of Ayn Rand get it wrong. Just the truth. So you're lucky to find someone who knows something about objectivism and can give you these answers. But no, ignore most of these, the content of most of these discussions of objectivism on the internet. They are way off base.
Yes. Now, I would say in terms of conflict, in terms of the hard questions, we've been taking it pretty easy so far. But the third question, and James, you selected these questions as you usually do. The third question on our list of questions today: can two objectivists disagree about a particular point without one of them being cast out of objectivist society? And before I get to Leonard Peikoff's answer, we have another super chat. Let's see. The user, I like numbers, in for $5. Thank you for that. Says, is this an attempt to morally intimidate Craig into backing out of the debate? Now, for folks who don't know, Craig Biddle is having a debate with Stephen Hicks, a brilliant philosopher, but a gentleman who's associated with the Atlas Society. Two very smart men, very intelligent. It's interesting. I don't know as much about Professor Hicks, although Yaron Brooks speaks highly of him. They are friends, despite Hicks' association with that organization. So it's not as simple as, well, anyway, I like numbers says, is this an attempt to morally intimidate Craig into backing out of the debate? My answer to that, my personal answer, of course not. It should be self-evident that I would never try to morally intimidate somebody like Craig Biddle into backing out of a debate. I think he has his reasons for doing this. I disagree with them, but I think he has compelling reasons. James, I'm curious what your take is on that.
Was the debate between Craig Biddle and the Atlas people an attempt to intimidate us out of our position about a closed system? Their announced debate came before any of this did. And clearly. So what we're doing is we're underlining our position before that happens. Part of my position is, and I'm happy to discuss it, we're discussing it here, I'm happy to discuss why I think the question of open objectivism is an inherently dishonest approach and concept, an anti-concept. I'm not attempting to do anything but to explain what I think are the facts about objectivism. Now, Craig Biddle may disagree with me about this. He's presumably taking my side. He may take positions that I had. He probably won't go so far as to say this is an inherently dishonest question, or he wouldn't be debating it. So he probably disagrees with me to that extent, but presumably he'll be on my closed side in some sense on this. No, what we're doing here is clarifying our position on the topic. We're not trying to intimidate him. It's a funny thing. You assert these things, and it's as though reality and logic were intimidating. Insofar as the facts support me and you find my position logical, boy, I'm sure it would sound, quote, intimidating. I'm not using any force, no other force but the force of reason here. So you can agree with me, you can disagree with me. I think I got reality on my side. If you find that intimidating, if you find my argument powerful and okay, then, well, maybe my argument's powerful, but I'm not doing it to psychologically intimidate anybody. As you say, I'm pretty sure that I'm not capable of psychologically intimidating the people in question here. Professor Hicks, do I find this is a great example of what we were talking about earlier. Do I find his work on, say, postmodernism of value? Would I cite that? Yes, I would. I find his work on postmodernism of value. Do I think he understands objectivism? Would I call him an advocate of objectivism insofar as he is arguing that there's such a beast as open objectivism? No, he rejects objectivism. Insofar as he believes that, he must reject the whole of objectivism. Now, does that mean that he doesn't have valuable things he can say as a scholar that I might even cite? Of course not. Of course not. We're after the truth here, people. We're not here to play psychological games with people. I'm trying to focus on the facts here. Philosophy, in fact, has to be a thoroughly integrated system. Ayn Rand's philosophy, in fact, is a thoroughly integrated system of philosophical principles. To reject any of those fundamental principles is to reject the whole of it by her own terms, by her own methodology and statement. That is to reject objectivism. Now, you may not like that. You may want to do whatever the heck you want with objectivism, but guess what? You can't. You cannot do that, honestly. You are stealing Ayn Rand's name. You are trying to glom onto her popularity, snatch her audience, get whatever warm, fuzzy glow that people have associated with her, and connect it to you. That is a dishonest approach in my mind, to still call it objectivism while you reject the very basic ideas that Ayn Rand had started her philosophy with.
Sure.
That's all.
But you just made a point. I mean, you just made a point very clearly. And the question would be, is that the point Craig Biddle intends to make during this debate? Now, we can talk, it's a different question about whether the debate should happen at all. And you did a whole episode on that. But given that Craig Biddle thinks that there is somebody to be reached by this, then hopefully, that would be the point that he would make. And we can say, but it's an inherently dishonest debate to have. But you could make that same point about, for example, his appearance with Dennis Prager. Is that an inherently dishonest debate? That's a complicated topic, and I'm not prepared to give an answer either way, because you could just as well say Yaron Brook should not have debated, half of the people that he's debated. Those were not honest questions for them to be. So, first of all, I've got to say, let me say, I like numbers, and you can tell me if you disagree with this, James Valliant, but is this an attempt to morally intimidate Craig into backing out of the debate? This is not an attempt to morally intimidate anybody. I would never try to morally intimidate somebody. Now, I like numbers could have asked, is this an attempt to convince Craig Biddle not to have the debate? But he didn't ask that. He asked if we're trying to morally intimidate Craig, which to me makes it's not an honest question. I'm not going to suggest that I like numbers had that motive, but
yeah, I'm laying out the reasons why I wouldn't do that. Now, if you find if those reasons are persuasive, then I don't know what psychological intimidation force it has, but words are a whole lot different than actual intimidation. I'm not trying to say back down or you're in trouble, Craig. No, that is the furthest thing from my mind.
Yes. I will try to convince a lot of people of a lot of things.
Now, I would say one of the observations I'd make is, given the fact of the nature of this debate, I think Craig has already put himself behind the 8 ball. I think he's already starting to lose the debate before it's begun. Now, you can say, am I intimidating him? Am I scaring him from engaging in the debate? By observing, in my view, that simply by engaging in this debate, he's giving bizarre nonsense credibility. Now, that puts you behind the 8 ball in any debate. I'd say that about any argument that I'd make about any other topic. But is that intimidating him? No. It's like saying, is a mathematician intimidating his students when he declares that 1 + 1 = 2? No. If you find that to be intimidating, what you're finding is reality to be intimidating, my friend.
Right. And I agree with that. I just think that the purpose of any debate is not to win the debate or convince your opposition. Because in modern debates, nobody ever convinces the opposition.
No.
Nobody ever really wins the debate. The real purpose of a debate is to reach people who are still thinking through the issue. And in that regard, this may, I don't know, it may end up having some value. And Amy in the chat says, perhaps Craig will watch this and compare notes. I don't think Craig, and I agree with this, I don't think Craig is morally intimidated by much.
No.
Whatever you think of the current conflict with Craig Biddle, a man who I have much to say about, but I'm not going to say it now. I have enormous respect for what he's achieved and accomplished. I think the current situation is not something I'm prepared to comment on now, but I do agree with Amy 100%. And yes, I think the question was loaded, and Amy is right. I don't think Craig's morally intimidated by much. It's certainly not what we're trying to accomplish here.
By no means.
Yes. So let me jump to question number 3, and this one has a real quick answer. Maybe we can get a little extra clarity if that wasn't enough for folks. Can two objectivists disagree about a particular point without one of them being cast out of objectivist society? And Leonard Peikoff says, see, I always pause because I can hear somebody saying, of course, they should be shunned. I hear people out there waiting for that answer. Leonard Peikoff says, can they be cast? Can they disagree without being cast out? And Leonard Peikoff says, yes, objectivism is not a religion. The only agreement it requires is agreement on fundamentals. This reality versus a supernatural or none. Reason versus faith or skepticism. Egoism versus sacrifice. Individual rights and capitalism versus statism, and so on. Well, that's what constitutes a philosophy. But the application of any of those two concretes usually leaves open tremendous room for interpretation and honest misinterpretation in judging an artwork, a mixed person, a confusing law, and the like. There is no way of saying that if you disagree, you're not an objectivist. If two rational people contradict each other, well, one is right and the other is not, but the one that is wrong is not, therefore, not an objectivist. You can't make being right a definition of objectivism, because then an objectivist would have to be infallible. This is a question that derives from religion and from the idea that if you question the dogma, you are cast out. Now, that is interesting because obviously there are people who, if they say they believe certain things and really mean it, I have to say, no, well, then you're not an objectivist. But that question of the phrasing, because the reason I have to read this right now is because of this question about morally intimidating. The question was, should they be cast out of objectivist society?
I can just tell you from someone who spent many a Saturday night at Dr. Leonard Peikoff's home that Dr. Leonard Peikoff had non-objectivists there almost every time. He was friendly with non-objectivists. He was friendly with people who were simply interested or found the idea curious or agreed with some aspect of it and were just starting a conversation with him about the topic, or some business associate of his who he just happens to get along with. So at Leonard Peikoff's home, at any given Saturday night, you would find totally non-objectivist people. And the other thing you'd find is people that he was comfortable identifying as objectivists or students of objectivism having intense arguments with one another. Oh my goodness, do you believe that? Oh no, did you believe that? Oh my goodness, no. And then they're marshaling their facts, they're marshaling their logic, an audience is developing around them as they're having this argument. And when the argument is all done, the two sides still disagree with one another, and Leonard Peikoff is still utterly convinced they're still objectivists, and everyone walks away and we're still friends. Yeah. Happens all the time. And you know objectivist community at all, you know that these are basic realities. And for that basic idea to be in people's heads, that's part of the lies that the Brandons, people like the Brandons gave us in their biographies, that Ayn Rand was just intolerant, or Murray Rothbard, the anarchist libertarian, who said that Ayn Rand excommunicated people for disagreeing with her taste in, or if you didn't like Rachmaninoff, you were excommunicated. I asked him personally, Murray, who was excommunicated for disagreeing with Ayn Rand's artistic taste or not liking Rachmaninoff? Oh, Jim, I was just fictionalizing. What? Wait, huh?
I was just making a point.
No, you were making it up. You were making up a lie, and a lie that was echoed and echoed and echoed by the Brandons, who really made it famous and made it caught hold, so that someone would ask this question. This very question being asked is the direct result. Now, you could say it's not only the direct result of these people lying about Ayn Rand and her movement, but you could say, hey, isn't it connected to this point you make about how philosophical principles are all integrated? Yeah. One could say that any basic principle there that you disagree with makes you not objectivist, but did that get you cast out of Leonard Peikoff's living room for not being an objectivist? No. The conversation still continues. You reject a basic point about objectivism, therefore you're not an objectivist in any meaningful sense. Now, if you are like David Kelly and someone who believes that, I guess, that you can have bits and pieces of objectivism and still be objectivism, and in other words, if you're rejecting the fundamental epistemological point that integration is a necessary part of achieving knowledge, including philosophical knowledge, then you're rejecting objectivism as such.
Right. And Yaron has made this point because, of course, he's in the middle of some of these conflicts. You don't have to like everybody who shares your philosophy. It's not like because you're an objectivist, you have to open your door to everybody who walks by who is a tried and true objectivist and bring them in and feed them dinner and hang out with them. You don't have to like.
You're not going to get me into trouble for telling you about people who are objectivists or big Ayn Rand fans who I personally just don't like. Because guess what? There are some people I just love. And they're my favorite people in the world. Really, my favorite people in the world are objectivists, most of them. But also some people I don't particularly like and wouldn't spend time with. It's not like I'd go have a cup of coffee or, play cards with them at all. So again, it's a totally separate question. That's not what we mean by integration. That's not what we mean by philosophy. It's not Ayn Rand's views. It's not all the other aspects of life that make someone likable or dislikable to you, or the kind of person you'd prefer to spend time with. That's not the point here. We are just talking about philosophical principles.
Right.
When it comes to philosophical principles, Ayn Rand's are tightly integrated and a unified whole that you either take as a whole or you reject as a whole.
And what does that look like in reality? Well, Kindred Amy in the chat says, some people act and think like such knuckleheads that you just don't want to work with them anymore. That is free association, not some religious casting out. Well, we've certainly seen that in Southeast Michigan. Maybe we were the knuckleheads some of those times, but some people just aren't compatible. And that is absolutely true. Now, we're getting close to the top of the hour, and all four of these questions were good ones. So I'm going to read the last one real quick, and Dr. Peikoff has a very short answer to it because we've left something out here. Are there authorities? Are there authorities qualified to issue statements on what ideas are or are not consistent with objectivism? That's another one where the answer seems obvious, but how many people get that one wrong and say, well, the authorities out there are well, here, let me read Leonard's answer. He says, and I love how he starts this. If I wanted to, I could try to argue, well, listen to me, because I know more. I've been endorsed by Ayn Rand. But I wouldn't say that because it would be pointless. It should be irrelevant to anybody who wants to know objectivism. You would have to ask, well, how do you know? Let me hear what you say. Let me hear the arguments. And then I will decide whether you know or whether you don't. Even if I don't have full knowledge, I can decide what you're saying is internally consistent and consistent with what I know of Ayn Rand or not. In other words, you can accept anybody who poses as an authority only to the extent that you judge by and with your own logic, your own evidence, your own ability to connect what's being said to what else you know. And then you can say, Well, this guy knew a lot. I wouldn't say authority in the sense of a Catholic pope, but he knew a lot, and I learned something. But if the person can't put forth that, and you can't find anybody who does that, well, then you either have to say, I have no view on that question or that philosophy, or I'm going to explore further, read, study, and so on. You can't just go to somebody who sounds good, nod your head and say, okay, I believe. And close quote, Leonard Peikoff. And yet people talk about, oh, these people are trying to assert their authority. Again, it's one thing to say, well, there are certain people I don't want to work with. I disagree with them. I think they're wrong, or even in some cases corrupt. It's another thing to say, I am the authority.
Leonard Peikoff never did that in all of my interactions with him. As I said, and I want to return to that point I made earlier. When you asked him a question and he got the whiff, you got a sincere question here. It was you, him, and reality. You, him, and reality. He's not going to be citing Ayn Rand just to cite Ayn Rand as an authority, or anyone else or anything else. He's relying on your logical assessment of the facts. And so, do we have the facts here? Do we make agreement on certain facts? And how do we approach figuring this out? Let's you and I figure this out. Wow, that's the way it has to be. It's not a function of authority. Now, of course, Ayn Rand wrote a brilliant article in The Virtue of Selfishness called Who is the Final Authority in Ethics? And one could broaden, her answer is applicable much more broadly than just to ethics, because she herself says, it's like asking the question, who's the final authority in physics? It's reality. Reality is the final authority. Judgment and knowledge is an individual thing. The only agent who thinks and knows is the individual. I'm sorry, you can't rest on any kind of authority in any sense on any question. That is what's one of the main things wrong with mysticism is just that. It's the turning over of your mind to some other authority, some church, some religious authority, or something else. That is always an inherently wrong. Always an inherently wrong to go by authority. Now, ideally, if someone was a college professor or a PhD or had written a big volume on the book, wouldn't it be nice if we could rely on them as experts? And very frequently they do have all kinds of knowledge that can help me. That's why I go to university or listen to professors talking about, or interact with professors, say about ancient history on Christianity. They are filled with knowledge that can help me. They're authorities in that sense, but only insofar as they actually have facts and arguments which are relevant and that are persuasive. It's not who they are, it's what they're saying and the truth of the content. So the authority is reality, and hopefully someone who's read a lot can give me a good indication of where I should be going in this. But unfortunately, you can't. The mere fact that of a PhD or someone being a college professor doesn't make them even that much of a, quote, authority. So alas, no, in no sense sometimes do we have authorities. And at the end of the day, it always has to be our own mind and our own judgment. We are all there alone between our own ears with the task of figuring everything out for ourselves, like it or not.
Oh, thank God. I mean, what would the alternative be?
Right.
Take it on faith? Well, I'm intentionally being ironic, but yes. And that essay, Who is the Final Authority in Ethics, originally from the Objectivist newsletter, 1965, reprinted in The Voice of Reason, is available on the Ayn Rand Institute website. Do a quick Google search and it will come right up.
Thank you for the correction. Voice of Reason.
So good. Such a good essay. And again, you can read it for free now on ARI's website. Highly recommended. Do a Google search for it, and I'll add it to the comments afterward as well. Outstanding. Well, James, it has been a bit of a roller coaster, a bit of an interesting ride. Because of again, some of these conversations were inspired by this upcoming debate, and some of them are just long-standing challenges to objectivism as a shared. See, there's nothing social about objectivism, and yet this is how we are finding kindred spirits. As you say, some of the best people are objectivists, and that's certainly true for me as well. And conversations like this, I hope, are helpful to people in clarifying just what philosophy has to say about.
We are going to discuss the issues as they come up, and we're going to give our honest opinion on them. I think I'm right, but like I say, we're all between our own ears and figuring these things out. And what I'm doing is laying out why I have the position I do, why I think that we shouldn't debate that question. Now, I know someone else is going to go debate that question. I know nothing I say will stop that debate from happening, but that debate raises the issue. And if we're an advocacy group for objectivism, then we have to make clear our own position on it. And it is different than the positions you'll probably hear at that debate. Yes. And so it's important for us to make that. Now, if you regard reality and logic as intimidating, I'm sorry. Reality is an absolute.
I will be curious to hear, if I get a chance to listen to the debate, what somebody like Professor Hicks will say. What could? Well, again, it's very easy for me to conclude that, well, there's not an honest answer to the question, therefore don't listen to what anybody says about it. I want to know, what does somebody mean by an open philosophy?
David Kelly had defined it earlier, and I think that Professor Hicks would be well served to abandon that approach altogether, because the one that David Kelly outlined when he founded the Atlas Society is the one I'm calling the inherently dishonest one. Right.
I understand that philosophy is open. I can't understand what an open system would be.
Exactly. There's so much to discover. There's so much to learn. I mean, think about it. I point out that my research on the history of Christianity is not objective. No, it isn't objectivism at all. But think of all the things that humans have to learn and discover. Think of all the ways humans can grow. It's a vast and wonderous universe out there with limitless vistas, limitless things for us to discover, adventures for us to live through. A closed system does not mean that we're not open to the whole of reality. We are. Every last bit of it, and even the parts we don't know yet and that we have yet to discover. All we're saying is that to approach a topic seriously, to get the truth of it, you have to follow certain epistemological rules of integration. And given the hierarchical position of philosophy in the whole of human knowledge, it is imperative that this be an integrated approach, a system, and therefore any philosophy, if it's going to be true, has to be closed. That is a condition. It's a condition of truth as far as I'm concerned. In this sense, it has to be systemically closed for it to meet a reality test. Now, if you reject that, you reject something so basic to objectivism. I have to say, you're not an objectivist. You reject objectivism. And I would wish that such people would have that kind of honesty.
Yes, they need a different name. They need a different name for that philosophy. I know what they're going to do is they're going to try to say, well, there's capital O objectivism and lowercase o like the libertarians did. Oh, I'm not one of those crazy libertarians. I'm a sort of libertarian. I kind of believe. God, I hope we don't have to put up with that. No, they need a name. They need their own. The Institute for Objectivist Studies has changed its name so many times. They should just change the name of the philosophy they advocate and basically get the hell out of my way, to steal a line.
You call it Kellyism, or I don't know. I'd still probably object to objectivism.
More like tolerationism.
Tolerationism. I think
because we tolerate any ideas.
Right, tolerate anything.
Big 10. A mind so wide open that our brains fall out.
Right.
Now I'm getting a little low there. So I will leave it there, but thank you, James. I think this has been a valuable conversation, especially with the chat. Thank you to those of you who participated in the chat. Let me just make sure I didn't miss any super chats. No, that was it, but they were very generous this time around. And again, everything that goes into the super chat supports this intolerant organization, the Ayn Rand Center UK. Your super chats, especially from DWN Logic, but also from Kindred Aid, all the super chats today, very generous. You are supporting the work that we do here. Every day, the Daily Objective gives you outstanding content at 6 p.m. UK time, 1 o'clock in the afternoon here on the East Coast, 10 o'clock in the morning for the bright and early risers out on the West Coast. If you want to continue to support the Ayn Rand Center UK, keep up those super chats, but also become a member. AynRandCenter.co.uk. You'll see a link at the top of the chat. If you're listening afterward, put in a super thanks. Some of you are very generous with that. Thank you for supporting the work that we do. It ain't easy. It ain't easy to be consistent with this philosophy. And as Jonathan Holmley likes to say, in a way, we're all still students. None of us are speaking for Ayn Rand. That philosophy is closed. No, we are speaking as best we can to be consistent with it. James, another outstanding discussion, great questions, great answers, and great insights from you from Leonard Peikoff's book, Keeping It Real. I look forward to doing this all over again next Wednesday. We went a little bit long. I'll stop now, but thank you for an outstanding and I think important and very personal discussion